everyone, good afternoon. My name is Amalya. I am a fifth-year PhD candidate at Stanford in Professor Fong Liu's group. And today I'll be talking about a project we worked on developing a new fabrication technique to engineer nanoscale bubbles and wrinkles into monolayer materials and see how that changes their thermal properties. So before we dive into the nanoscale, I'd like to zoom out a little bit and talk about the macroscopic analog of the material we're trying to emulate, bubble wrap. Bubble wrap is an ubiquitous material used to dissipate mechanical vibrations and limit their propagation across an interface. In this work, we're trying to use this idea and bring it down to the nanoscale so that we can limit atomic vibrations and limit the propagation of atoms across nanoscale interfaces. So you can imagine that when you get a delivery of a fragile package, you have bubble wrap that's limiting the package breaking on a bumpy delivery truck. And so here what we're trying to do is, can we develop a new material to limit atomic vibrations across nanoscale interfaces, say if we have a sensitive material on our integrated circuit that we don't want to interact with other parts of the chip. And so to do this, we'll be exploring how to fabricate these nanoscale bubbles and wrinkles into two-dimensional or van der Waals materials. So we had a really nice talk yesterday that went in depth, kind of introducing these materials. But to repeat just a little bit, van der Waals materials are layered crystals with strong covalent bonds in plane, but weak van der Waals forces out of plane. This allows us to mechanically exfoliate or isolate single layers of these materials and have materials that are stable at just one atom thick. This materials class spans a wide range of different material types, from insulators to semiconductors or superconductors. But today I'll just focus on the semiconducting transition metal dichalcogenides, or TMDCs, as I'll call them from now on, where we have a transition metal, so molybdenum or sulfur, bound to a chalcogen atom, so transition metal is molybdenum or tungsten bound to an atom like sulfur or selenium. And these are semiconductors, so they're interesting for applying to anything where semiconductors are used, which is in all the computer chips. But why do we care about controlling atomic vibrations in these materials? So in materials, we call the collective vibrations of atoms phonons. And here what I'm showing is the phonon dispersion for monolayer MOS2. So you can think of this as just all the possible different vibrational states or phonon modes that are available in this material as a function of their vibration frequency and momentum. If we zoom into a specific point on one of these lines, we can visualize what a single phonon mode or vibrational state looks like. So here what we have is an oscillation of the sulfur or the yellow atoms out of plane in MOS2 monolayer. At another point on one of these curves, we have a mode that has a different vibration and a different frequency. So this is what's known as the E' mode, where we have this in-plane motion of the chalcogen and the transition metal atoms. So in this work, what we're interested in trying to figure out is, can we use nanoscale bubbles and wrinkles to control these atomic vibrations and then thus control thermal transport in these materials? Because in semiconductors and insulators, phonons are the main heat carriers in these materials. And so to figure this out, we need to fabricate these nanoscale bubble wraps. And so to do this, what we start is what we call bulk MOS2. And so this is the three-dimensional or large-scale counterpart of monolayer MOS2 that kind of just looks like a rock. It's a crystal. And because these layers of this material are bound by these weak van der Waals forces, we're able to mechanically exfoliate single layers of these materials and get isolated monolayers. In the Liu lab, we use the technique of gold tape exfoliation, where we take advantage of the strong adhesion between a metal, here gold, and a monolayer to break the van der Waals forces of the material and layer by layer disassemble the bulk crystal into individual monolayers. So here what we're looking at are 6 monolayers of MOS2 on silicon dioxide on silicon chips, where the blue area is all a monolayer, and we're able to engineer these up to lateral dimensions of millimeters, if not centimeters in scale, which for two-dimensional materials is very big. So now we have these nice monolayers, but we want to make some bubble wrap. So to do this, we developed a technique where we can engineer nanoscale local periodic deformations into the material and control how many there are and their shape and size. We do this by transferring the monolayer using a polymer, so a sticky substance to just pick it up. We transfer it onto a rigid periodic mold. Because these layers are so thin, they're able to conform to the mold. And then after that, we can transfer them off, put them on any other substrate that we'd like, and then dissolve the polymer layers used for transfer, and are left with a large area monolayer with nanoscale bubbles and wrinkles. So here what we're looking at is atomic force microscopy images after using this fabrication technique, where the bright areas are the taller areas on the monolayer. And we can see how we can use this technique to engineer these nanoscale bubbles and wrinkles in a wide range of TMDC monolayers. We can imagine that if we were able to zoom in a little bit more and look at the atomic structure in these different regions, in the flat areas, we can imagine there would be the typical MOS2 crystal lattice, but in the wrinkled and bubbled areas, we have sort of this out-of-plane displacement of the atoms and are getting this additional bending and strain in the monolayer. And so now what we want to determine is if this additional bending and strain is impacting the vibrational modes of the system. So to do that, we use Raman spectroscopy. And so this is a very common technique in material science or chemistry, where we use a laser to excite vibrational modes or phonons in materials. And then when we measure the scattered light from the laser, we get peaks in intensity from the frequencies that are at the frequencies of these phonon modes. So again, we're able to measure the E' and the A' mode in monolayer MOS2. And if we do this for a series of different samples, we can see how these modes change in our different wrinkled samples. So because our fabrication technique is so reproducible and controllable, we can measure a variety of wrinkled samples with different densities or spacings between the different wrinkles. And what we see is that in all of the wrinkled samples, there is a decrease in the position of the peak, which we call a redshift. So what we're seeing is that there is a lowering of the frequency in the wrinkled samples. And if we were able to zoom in a little bit more, we can imagine that for the flat monolayer, there is some standard frequency of oscillation of the sulfur atoms out of plane for the A' mode. But in the wrinkled systems, we get a slowing down of this out of plane motion of the sulfur atoms. To kind of dive in a little bit more about why we think this is happening, we can imagine, again, that in the wrinkled sample, we have these areas of bending and stretching that are impacting the phonon modes. So I sometimes like to think as atoms in materials as masses on springs. So when we have this stretching, we are weakening those bonds between the atoms. And you can think of that as decreasing the spring constant of a harmonic oscillator. And so you'll be decreasing that frequency of oscillation of this mode. And so now what we've shown here is that we can engineer these nanoscale bubble wrap systems, and that will change the atomic vibrations in the crystal. But how does that impact the thermal transport? So in order to figure this out, we'll use Raman again. And so now we crank up the laser power to use it as a heating source in the system. And to first order this as a function of power, we will again see a redshift, so a lowering of the frequency of the different Raman modes. And this happens for a few different reasons, but one of them is because when we're heating the sample, we have thermal expansion, which is again stretching those bonds, weakening those bonds, and lowering the frequency of the different modes. We perform another experiment where we keep the laser power low and change the temperature of the stage that our sample is sitting on so that we can correlate the different peak positions to an actual temperature of the material. At the end of the day, what we get is an understanding of how the temperature of the material is changing with different laser power. And we can fit this to a thermal dissipation model where the thermal properties of our material of interest are our best fit parameters. So here what we're interested in is the in-plane and the out-of-plane thermal conductivity. We do this for all of our nano-wrinkled samples, and we measure a reduction in both the in-plane and the out-of-plane thermal conductivity of about 50% for the samples with wrinkles in them. We believe that this happens because, as I said before, what we observed is a decrease in the phonon mode frequencies in these deformed samples. This also leads to a decrease in the group velocities, or the speed of phonons moving in the sample, which will impact and lower the thermal conductivity in plane. Additionally, where we have these regions of bending and separation of the material from touching the substrate, this will just decrease the out-of-plane thermal transport because we'll have these air gaps, and air has a very low thermal conductivity. And so next, we were interested in how we can take this one step further and try to engineer materials with extremely low thermal conductivities. So for this, we use a slightly different technique called time-domain thermal reflectance. And I won't go into the details now, but in general, we deposit a metal layer on top of our samples of interest. We heat the metal with a laser and measure the rate of cooling of the metal as a function of time, because this is dependent on the thermal properties of all of the materials underneath the metal. So what we wanted to look at here is placing an additional monolayer on top of our nanoscale bubble wrap systems, because it's been shown previously that having two van der Waals materials on top of each other can lead to extremely low thermal boundary conductances or thermal transport in the out-of-plane direction. And what we're able to see is that when we compare our nano-wrinkle monolayers to our flat system, and additionally when we have these monolayers on top of nano-wrinkled systems, we get up to 100 times reduction in the out-of-plane thermal transport of these materials. So returning to our original question, what we can see is that after being able to modulate the vibrations of phonons in these materials, we can additionally tune the thermal transport in these systems. And so looking forward, we're interested in applying these new materials to a variety of different things. So you can think that they can be used to spread heat in specific directions in different systems. If you have really low thermal transport in one direction and higher thermal transport in the other, they can be used for thermal isolation and also for energy conversion applications like thermoelectrics, which can convert waste heat into energy. And so overall, I'd like to thank my group. My main group is the Lou Lab at Stanford, but I work a lot with Archana Raj's group at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And I thank my funding and am open to any other questions. Thanks.